How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ches, Daf 88 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, on today's Daf we learn about liquid measures. Yesterday we began the 10th parak of Masechta Menachos, parak Shtei Midos Shel Yavesh. We discussed yesterday the two types of dry measures that there were in the temple, the Isaron and the half Isaron. Today we are going to discuss the 7 wet measures, moist measures, liquid measures. We will discuss those. We will also discuss in the menorah, if one of the candles one of the lamps of the menorahs of the menorah extinguishes, right? The menorah was lit every afternoon, and it would burn, and the lights would be lit all night. What if one of the lamps extinguished before the morning? What do you do in terms of rekindling it? And finally, the construction of the menorah lamps. Of course, as we've learned in the past, the menorah was constructed, was chiseled out of one solid block of gold, and it was chiseled out of that. There is a question about whether the lamps were part of that requirement of being from that same block, or could they be separate that you could put on and remove so that they can be cleaned, and how does that affect the ability to clean them? And we will be discussing that topic. Friends, this is the agenda for Daf Ches of Masechta Menachos. Now we are going to go get it. We begin on Daf Zayin Amid Beis at the Mishnah towards the bottom on the first wide line of Zayin Amid Beis. Says the Mishnah, Sheva Midos Shel Lach Ayu B'Mikdash. There were 7 liquid measures in the Holy Temple. Hin v'chatzi hin, a hin which is 12 logs, and a half hin which is 6 logs. V'shlishis ahin, for a third of a hin, 4 logs. V'revius ahin, a quarter of a hin, 3 logs. Log, v'chatzi log, v'revius log, as well as a log, a half a log, and a quarter log. So maybe if we go from the smallest to the largest, we have a quarter of a log, a half a log, a 3 logger, a 4 logger, a 6 logger, and a 12 logger, otherwise known as a hin. Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Eliezer Tzadok Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer Tzadok Shnosos hayu bahin adkan lepar v'adkan la'ayil adkan lekav. This is machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. What this means? Rashi says what this means is that there actually weren't 7 unique measures. There was one measure, the hin, and there were lines on the hin, and it would say, well, if you're looking for a whole hin, well, I guess if it was the size of a hin, it would just be the whole thing. If you're looking for half of a hin, this is how much to fill it up. If you're looking for a third of a hin, this is how high you want to fill it up. A quarter of a hin, 1 log, half a log, etc. There were different lines so basically you just had a hin, and there would be lines to say, hey, if this is the measure you're looking for, stop filling here. So Rashi says that it was just one measure. It was just a hin, and with lines to tell you where to go, and that includes half logs, quarter of logs, etc. Tosfos, however, quotes a Tosefta in which Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok says that there were 4 measures in the temple rather than 7, and not 1 either. And if you notice in the Mishnah, he only mentions what Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok Omer, Shnosos hayu bahin adkan lepar v'adkan la'ayil v'adkan lekevis. That the point of when we say that there were lines in the hin, it was only as far as the hin, the third of a hin, the half a hin, third of a hin, quarter of a hin, but there was still the log, half a log, and quarter of a log. So there was basically going from smallest to largest, quarter of a log, half a log, and then you would have a hin with lines on it. So there were four vessels rather than what. So Rashi says there was 1 vessel with lines on it. Tosfos disagrees based on a Tosefta and says that according to Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok, there were 4 vessels: the quarter of a log, the half log, the log, and then the hin. And the hin had lines on it to tell you where the max is, where you're looking for a half a hin, a third of a hin, and a quarter of a hin. Reb Shimon, shall I read that inside again? Okay. Reb Elazar Reb Tzadok Omer says, Reb Elazar Reb Tzadok shenoso soybein, that there were lines in the hin. Ad kan lepar, this is where you're going to fill up to a cow, which is half of the hin.Vad kan le'ayil, you're going to fill up to here for the ram, which is a third of a hin. Ad kan lekeves, and here you're going to fill up for a sheep, which is a quarter of a hin. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon lo oya sham hin, v'chima oya hin mishamish. Reb Shimon says, there was no hin measure in the Beis Hamikdash because it was unnecessary. Tell me what a hin is used for. The highest size, the largest size that we have is for a cow, the oil and the wine for a cow, which is half a hin, 6 logs. So what do you need the hin for? Elamida yisera shel log v'mechza oisasham. Rather, swap out the hin for a 1.5 loger. Sheba aya moded leminchas kohen gadol log v'mechza v'boker log v'mechza ben ha'abayim. That of course the minchas chavitin of the kohen gadol was 1 isaron of flour and 3 logs of oil. However, that was divided into 2 because the minchas chavitin was offered half in the morning and half in the afternoon, which means that in the morning there was a log and a half of oil, and in the afternoon there was a log and a half of oil. So therefore, Shimon says that for that purpose, there was a 1.5 loger measure that would be used to measure out the oil for the minchas chavitin. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Sheva midos shalach ayu b'mikdash. There were 7 liquid measures in the holy temple. Revius log, a quarter of a log, v'chatzi log, a half a log, v'log, a log, v'revius ahin, a quarter of a hin, 3 logs, v'shlishis ahin, a third of a hin, 4 logs, v'chatzi ahin, half a hin, 6 logs, v'hin, a whole hin, divrei Rabbi Yehuda, that is Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda basically listed all of the same measures that we had in the Mishnah, except that he was going from smallest to largest. And now we're going to see Reb Meir's opinion, which is exactly the opinion of our Mishnah, which is from largest to smallest, but it's the same exact opinion. The Gemara is going to ask what the difference is. Reb Meir says, Reb Meir, hin, v'chatzi hin, v'shlishis hin, v'revius hin, v'log, v'chatzi log, v'revius log. Reb Shimon Omer lo haya sham hin, v'chima hoya hin mishamish. As we saw Reb Shimon's shita in the Mishnah, who needs the hin? What are you using a hin for? We don't need it. Get rid of it. As me, avi tachtov, what will I replace the hin with? Because we're going to see later on why Reb Shimon wants to maintain this this number 7. So therefore, if we're going to be removing the hin, so we're going to have to replace it with a different measure so that there are still 7 of these liquid measures. Says me, avi tachtov, ella Midi Yisera Shel Log V'Mechza Isa, the 1.5 loger. Ha'isa Sham Shebo Aya Moded L'Chavite Kohen Gadol Log V'Mechza V'Boker Log V'Mechza Ben Ha'abayim, and that was used to measure out the 1.5 logs of oil for the Minchas Chavitin in the morning as well as for the afternoon. Amrulo, they said to Reb Shimon, Chatzi Log Isa Sham. The rabbi said to Reb Shimon, they said, the 1.5 loger is unnecessary. Why is it unnecessary? Because we have a half loger. Chatzi log, we have a half loger. The efshar l'shayr b'chatzi log. You could just have 3 half logers. So why do I need a log and a halfer? Why do I need a log and a halfer? Just take the half log, dip it, and scoop up. Fill it up with oil 3 times. You have your 1.5 logs. Amiloim, Reb Shimon says to the rabbis, well, after the devrechem, 1 second, not so fast. I can ask you guys the same question. Chatzi log, v'log, lo yeose, revius aiser sham, v'efshar l'shayr b'revius. According to you, rabbis, there is a log, a half a log, a quarter of a log. Why? All you need really is the quarter of a log. 2 of them makes half a log. 4 of them makes a whole log. So why do we need a half a log and a full log? All we need is a quarter of a log. So klal, rather, this is the rule. There was a rule in the holy temple. Mida zo eina mishamish mida acheres. That we have unique measures. And therefore, as we're going to learn out in the next Mishnah, also later on this Amud, as we're going to learn in the next Mishnah, that we're going to say, what was the quarter of a log used for? What was the half log used for? What was the full log used for? So, for example, the quarter of a log was used to measure out the oil for the loaves of the Nazir. Okay, fine. What was the half a log used for? To measure out the oil for the loaves of the Korban Todah. Okay, great. So there's a purpose for the quarter log, for the Nazir, for the half log, for the Todah. So each one's gonna get their own unique measure. The Nazir is gonna have its measure, the Todah is gonna have its measure. We're not just gonna repurpose the Nazir's measure and say, hey, we could just double it up for the Todah as well. No, each one will get its own measure. Again, Zeklal Oya B'Mikdash, this was the rule in the Mikdash, Kli Shemishamish Mida Zo, Eino Mishamish Mida Acheres. That, for example, in our example, the quarter of a log, which is for the Nazir, is going to be strictly for the Nazir. We're not going to repurpose it for the Korban Todah. The Korban Todah will have its own measure of half a log. Ma'ika bein Reb Meir le Reb Yehuda. So as everybody was waiting patiently to know the answer to, what in the world is the difference between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda? What, just the order? Reb Yehuda goes from smallest to largest, and Reb Meir goes from largest to smallest? What, practically speaking, what's the nafkamina? Ma'ika bein Reb Meir le Reb Yehuda. What's the nafkamina? Rabbi Yechanan beirutze midas ika benayu. The nafkamina is, says Rabbi Yechanan, the overbrim of the measures. That if you're going to use a quarter of a hin, a quarter of a hin, a revius, a quarter of it, no, not a hin, also a hin, but if you're going to use a quarter of a log to scoop up, to use our example, if you can use a quarter of a log to scoop up the oil for the loaves for the Lachmei Nazir, so when you scoop up the oil, there's going to be some extra oil over brimming. That is just, if you just keep on holding it there, it'll just leak over the sides and kind of drip down. But what if you just immediately scoop up some oil and put it in a bigger measure, so you can have more than just than strictly speaking a quarter of a log. You can have an over brimming quarter of a log. Right? Again, if you just keep on holding the quarter of a log, it would over brim and drip down. But if you quickly dump it into a larger measure, so then you can have a bit more, that you can have that quarter of a log plus whatever the over brim is. So the nafkamina is that. Lemanda Omer Mimata Lemaila, Rabbi Yehuda, who's listing the measures from smallest to largest, Kosover he holds Beirutse Hamidis Niskadshu. He says, Rabbi Yehuda holds that when making the measures, so you have the quarter of a log, the half a log, the quarter of a hin, etc. So included in those measures was taken into account the over brim of the smaller measures, which is why it goes from smallest to largest, i.e. that what the Rabban Shalom is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, he's saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, here is a, excuse me, I need some water. My throat still is not quite 100%. Anyways, what the Rabban Shalom is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu is, Moshe Rabbeinu, here is a quarter of a log. You are going to use this quarter of a log in order to make the half a log, the full log, the quarter of a hin, etc. And what you're going to do is, here's a quarter of a log. A half a log is obviously two of these. However, I want the size of the half a log to be large enough that if you take the quarter of a log and scoop up an over-brimming scoop and immediately dump it into that half a log and scoop up another quarter of a log and an over-brimming quarter of a log and dump that into the half a log as well, the half a log should be able to hold not just the exact quarter logs, but also their over brim. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, he lists from smallest to largest to say that as you're constructing, as you're building each larger measure, it should also be able to hold not just the exact measures of the smaller measure, but the smaller measure plus whatever is over brimming from it. The larger measure should be able to hold the over brim as well. Again, the Manda Omer Mimata Lamaila, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says from less to more, from smallest to largest, Kasover Beirutze Amidos Niskadshu. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that the over brim is also going to be mitkadesh. That when when there is oil or wine, but let's say oil, when there is oil in the measure, that measure should be able to hold, and because it's a klisharis, be mikadesh, not just the exact amounts of the smaller measure, but also its over brim as well. V'revius yoivle rachmana l'Moshe, and the Rabbanah Shalom gives Moshe Rabbeinu a quarter of a log. V'amar lein, he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, sha'er dika ayle lehu berutzin, that when measuring out the half a log, make sure that the over brim of the quarter of a log would also be able to fit into the half a log. And I imagine also that when you're creating the log, make sure that the over brim of the half a log would be able to fit in as well. However, according to Meir, who's saying from top down, he's saying each one is just half of the one before it, right? So you start with not necessarily half, but start with a hin, exactly half of that is a half a hin. And exactly a third of the hin is the third of a hin, and exactly a quarter of a hin is a quarter of a hin, etc. There's no overflow. Kasov beirutze midos lo niskachu. Reb Meir says that the overflows are not going to become kadosh in the vessel. The hin yoiv le rachmano, and the Rabbanah Shalom gives Moshe Rabbeinu a hin, and he says work from there. The Moshe gives to Moses ve'omar le, and he says sha'er beha the konafke berutzin, and when you are dividing up this hin into smaller increments, do not include the over brim of the measures. I need more water. Says Abaye Omar Dechuli Alma Beirutze Amidos Ika Lemeimar Niskachu Vika Lemeimar Lo Niskachu. Abaye says, Abaye says, look, you can really go either way. Either you could say that both Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda say that the overbrim is included, or that they both say it's excluded. He didn't feel that was really enough. Milayim, if forget what they're arguing about is milayim. When the pasuk says by the Chanukah Samizbeach, by the Nisim, when it says, I'm going to read the pasuk of Korbanu Kairis Kesef Achash Shloshim U'Mea Mishkola Mizok Echad Kesef Shivim Shekel B'Shekel Shnei Milayim, and both the Kaira and the Mizrak were filled. Soles Blula Bashem and the Mincha, they were filled. What does filled mean? Man de Omar Milamayla Lamata Reb Meir, who's listing the measures from top down, Kosavariyos Milayim Shelo Yechso V'Shlo Yosir. Okay, he says that full means exactly full, not more than that, not less than that. Man de Omar Mimata Lamayla, and Reb Yehuda says from smallest to largest, Milayim Shelo Yechsar, there shouldn't be any less than each measure. Avol Yoser Milayim Karina Bey, but you can have more. Meaning that if you take, so from the bottom up, so if you start with a revius and you, let's say, pour 2 reviuses into the half a log, there's going to be some foam, and the half a log should be able to hold that foam as well, but it can't have any less than the required measure. Okay. Fine. So if I understand correctly, I think Be'etzim, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that according to Rabbi Yehuda, each larger measure has to be able to hold the overflow. According to Abaye, it has to be able to hold the foam. Okay. I'm not really super clear on what exactly the difference is. I think it's actually a question. I saw in a note in the article. I think it's a question. Okay. Fine. Omar Mar. We said earlier, Reb Shimon Omer lo aya sham hin. Reb Shimon says there was no hin. Instead, there was a log and a half. So the Gemara says, Shapir ka'amar l'hu Reb Shimon d'Rabbanan. Reb Shimon makes a valid argument. There's no need, there's no purpose for the hin measurement. So why have it? There's nothing that uses a hin. Rabbanan have a hin d'avad Moshe l'shemen hamishcha. But the rabbis say, well, the shemen hamishcha that Moshe Rabbeinu prepared in the wilderness, the Chsiv says, v'shemen zayis hin, that there was a hin of olive oil. That in preparing the shemen hamishcha that Moshe Rabbeinu prepared in the wilderness, that was used to anoint Aharon, his children, the Mishkan, the Mizbeach, I believe, the Kalim. So that had a hin of oil. My Sovar, Reb Shimon holds, came into Lidoris lo hava tzarich lefisha who. Okay, fine. Where am I? So my Sovar, Reb Shimon holds, came into Lidoris lo hava tzarich, that since the hin was not necessary for future generations, it was necessary as a chad pa'ami thing, as a one-time thing. Moses was preparing the shemen hamishcha in the wilderness. So the fisha who the avde v'iganis, there was a hin that was made for that one-time purpose, and afterwards it was hidden away. And therefore we don't need a hin anymore, and instead a more useful measure would be a log and a half, and that is what we make instead, according to Reb Shimon. V'idach, whereas the rabbis say, came to hava in a chinami, there is no longer a use for a hin, but there was once a use for a hin, and once the hin was made for that use, it stayed. Omer Mai, we said earlier, ve'es mi avi tachtob. So Reb Shimon says, well, if I don't have the hin anymore, what am I going to replace it with? So he says a log and a half. Lo saged lo ma'ayil? Who cares? How about this? We don't need the hin. Get rid of the hin. What to replace it with? Replace it with nothing. Why do I have to replace it with anything? Kidam Ravina, it's like Ravina says, Gemir shtei smichos b'tzibur. Hachanami gemir desheva midos shalacha ubamikdash. Well, just like Ravina in a different context that we're going to get to, I think, in a few days, he says that when it comes to korban tziburs, there were only two examples of smicha. I believe that one of them was the Parlim Dovish Tzibur. The other one, I think, was on Yom Kippur. Maybe the Sa'ir LaHashem, or maybe the Sa'ir LaZozo. One of the Sa'irs on Yom Kippur. Wait, it was on Daf 62. Yeah, what does it say here? V'Sa'ir Mishtalech. Yeah, the Sa'ir LaZozo. There was Smicha. That's it. There's only two examples, right? We have Alach Moshe Misinai. That there's only, I believe that's the point. So Alach Moshe Misinai, that there's only two smichas on korban tziburs. So Achnami Gemire, we have a tradition that the Sheva Midos Shalacha Mikdash, that there were seven liquid measures in the holy temple, and therefore, if the hin is removed, then you only have six. So what's being replaced with? The log and a half. Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok says, Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok Shnaser Sayu Bahin V'Leislei Sheva Midos. Now, according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, he says that the hin had marks on it. Whether like Rashi, who says that there was only all these seven were instead really just one measure which was a hin with all these marks on it, or whether according to Tosfos, who says that there were, based on the Tosefta, that there were four measures, one of which was the hin that had marks on it for the half, third, and quarter. Either way, there aren't seven. So leisle. So one way to answer it is that Reb Elazar Reb Tzadok doesn't have this tradition. Alternatively, my sheva midos, sheva mididos. That Reb Elazar Reb Tzadok says, no, it wasn't seven measures. It wasn't that there were, right? Yes, there's a lot there. I don't know. I think Gemir would probably be Alach Moshe Misinai, I think. But at the very least, the tradition. So he also has that tradition. But he says it's not that it's seven measuring cups, not that it's seven measures, but seven etchings. And according to Rashi, you can just have one hin with seven etchings, and that's what it's referring to. Alternatively, four vessels, but I guess each vessel, four vessels, one of them with all these etchings. So at the end of the day, you have four kind of, not seven, right? Not necessarily seven measuring vessels, but seven measures, right? Whether they're cups or lines on cups, but you have seven measures, even if they're not seven different unique cups. Givaldig. And now we get up to the next mission of the day. What were the uses for all of these measures? Revius ma'isa mishameshes. What was the use for the revius halog? Revius ma'im limitzora. The Chumash describes at the beginning of Parshas Mitzorah. When's that coming up? Vayikra Tzav Shmini. I think next week is Tazria Mitzorah, so it's going to be next week's Parsha. We got a lot of double Parshas coming up. Those are going to be difficult. After this week, the next 3 out of the next 4 Parshas are doubles, I think. Tazria Mitzorah, Achrei Mos Kedoshim, then there's Emor, then there's Bahar B'Chukosai. 3 out of the next 4 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, are double Parshas. Those are difficult. Anyways, the beginning of Parshas Mitzorah describes, of course, the process of the purification of the Mitzorah. In step 1 of the process, the Kohen goes out to meet him michutz labachne, outside of the camp, and there are 2 birds. I guess the Kohen probably brings with him 2 birds. And eitz erez v'shnis tolaz ve'ezov, and one of the birds is slaughtered into water. Right, the blood of the slaughtered bird mixes together with water. How much water? A revius of water. So that measure was used to measure the revius of water for a mitzvah. Revius shemen lenazir, and also as we have learned that the lachme nazir. Of course, the Nazir, when he's completed being a Nazir, brings the Ale Nazir, which is a type of shlomim, and it comes together with 2 types of loaves. Unlike a Toda, which comes with 4 types of loaves, the Ale Nazir comes with 2 types of loaves. And we said that the Toda comes with a half a log of oil, as we're going to see in a second. Half of that half a log, a revius halog, was for the chalas and rikikin, and the other revius was for the revuchin. Now, I believe that was the other one, the revuchin. Now, so by the Toda, there was a quarter of a log for the chalos and the rikikin. Now, a Nazir only brings the chalos and the rikikin, and it's a quarter of a log for them. So the lachme mitzorah, there was a quarter of a log of oil for them. The lachme nazir, right? Yeah. Chatzi log ma hoya mishamish. What do they do with the half log? Chatzi log mayim lesota. That a sota, the mayim, the may amayim, the may amarim hamarim, the may amayim, the may amarim hamarim, I think is what it is, right? The cursed bitter waters of the Sota, the Mishnah in Masechta Sota describes that a half a log of water was taken from the kiyur in the Azar. So v'chatzi log mayim lisota, v'chatzi log shem letoda, and a half a log of oil for the lachme toda. Uvilog, what do we do with the full log? Ayamoded lichol menachos. Well, all the menachos, we're working with logs. Whether we're talking about a minchas nedava, that by default would be 1 isaron of flour and 1 log of oil, or whether we're talking about the minchas nesachim, that would have 3, 4, 6 logs of oil. Those would be measured. Oh, no. So one second. No, right. So we said that there was those would have the minchas nesachim. They had their own quarters and thirds and halves, as we're gonna, right, as we mentioned already. But the minchas nedava, so you'd bring a isaron of flour and a log of oil, and let's go weiter for a second. Afilu mincha shel samech isaron, even if your mincha is going to be 60 isarons, you decided you want to bring a mincha of 60 isarons, no sin la samech log, you're going to use this log measure and measure out 60 logs of oil. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov omer afilu mincha shel samech isaron ein la ela loga. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disagrees, and he says, even if you have a mincha of 60 isarons of flour, it will still be just one log of oil. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, lemincha v'log shemen, one singular log of oil for the mincha, even if it's 60 isarons. Now, shisha lapar, there was a measure of 6 logs, a half a hin, ve'arba la'ayil, and 4 logs, a third of a hin, ve'shlosha lakeves, and 3 logs, a quarter of a hin, shlosha v'mechza menorah, chatzi log l'chol ner. And also there were 3.5. There were where am I? There were 3.5 logs necessary for the menorah, as we're going to see also in the Gemara. Chatzi log l'chol ner. There was 1/2 of a log for each candle. Givaldik. Says the Gemara, Yosef Rebbe v'kakashele, Rebbe was wondering. Revius lama nimshecha. Oh. At the end of the day, why do we need the Revius to be a klesharis? Okay, we're saying that there were these different measures in the Beis Hamikdash, and they were klesharis. They were meaning anything that would go in these measures would become kadosh. Why would we need to be mikadesh? Why would we need the quarter of a log? Lama nimshecha. Why was it anointed? Why did it become a klisharis? To be mikadesh, whatever goes in it. Mitzora. Chutzu. The mitzora, right? We said what was a quarter of a log necessary for? It was necessary for the water, for the mitzora, for the tzipor ashchuta, for the blood to go into the water. But the thing is, that was happening in Michutz Lamachan. That wasn't happening in the Beis Hamikdash. So why would we want to be mekadesh that water? Lechem Nazir, Meshchitas Ayil Udi Kadesh. And when it comes to the loaves of a Nazir, the loaves of a Nazir, like the loaves of a Toda, become kadosh when the korban is slaughtered, when the ayil is slaughtered by the El Nazir. When the ayil is slaughtered, at that point the loaves become kadosh. So why do we need to use a klisharis to make the oil that's going to be mixed together with the flour? Why does that oil need to become kadosh? The breads are only becoming kadosh not when they're being made, but later on when the korban is slaughtered. So why do we need this quarter of a log to be anointed, to be a klisharis, to be mikadesh, whatever goes inside of them? So B'chia says to Rebbe, Sheboha Yamoded L'chavite Koin Gadol. Because the Sheboha Yamoded L'chavite Koin Gadol. Revius shemen l'chol chala v'chala. Because the chavite kohen gadol, the minchas chavitin of the kohen gadol, was 1 isaron of flour, which was divided in half, and 3 loaves of oil. Now, the flour and the loaves were there was the minchas chavitin was 12 loaves. Half, right, 6 in the morning. Machlek is 6 in the, whatever. Half in the morning, half in the afternoon. Now, 3 loaves of oil for 12 loaves. If you divide 3 by 12, it's a quarter of a log of oil for each loaf. And says Reb Chia, what was the quarter of a log necessary for? Why did we need it to be anointed, to be a klisharis, to be mekadesh, the oil that goes in it? For the preparation of the minchas chavitin, that the minchas chavitin at its 12 loaves, for 3 loaves of oil, 3 divided by 12 is a quarter. So you would use the quarter of a log measure when preparing the minchas chavitin, a quarter of a log of oil for each loaf for the minchas chavitin. Yosef Rebbe v'kakashale once. I'm sorry, I skipped. I skipped. L'chol chala v'chala kari ole. So Rebbe says about Reb Chia, me'eretz merchok ish atzasi, from a faraway land, because Reb Chia came from Babble. He made aliyah from Babble to Eretz Yisrael. So says Rebbe, from a faraway land, a man of my advice, my advisor, I guess. Chatzi log ma'oy meshamish. What was the use of the half log? Yosef Rebbe v'kakashale. Once again, Rebbe was wondering, why does the half log need to be anointed, to be mekadesh, whatever goes inside of it? Chatzi log lama nimshach. Why did it have to be a klisharis? Ilis sota. If, well, before for the water of the sota. V'chichulin hu detzriche. I'm sorry. V'chichulinu detzriche lekadushe ma'im kedoshim ksiv. The pasuk says, what does the pasuk say by sota? It says v'lokach hakoyin ma'im kedoshim, that the kohen takes holy water. What's the holy water? Water from the kior. The kior was already mekadesh, whatever water was in there. So you're taking water that's already kadosh. You don't need to be mekadesh it in this klisharis of the half log. Itoda. And if we're saying we need the half a log of oil for the lachmei toda b'shchitas todo dikache, just like we said by the lachmei nazir, also the lachmei toda become kadosh when the korban, when the animal is slaughtered. That's when they become kadosh. Therefore, there's no reason to make the oil kadosh when they're going to be mixed together with the flour before they're even baked. They're not becoming kadosh until later on when the korban is slaughtered. Amalei Reb Shimon Berebi, says Reb Shimon Berebi to his father, well, for the hatovas haneris, for the preparation of the menorah to be lit, each lamp in the menorah would receive a half a log of oil. And for that use, the half log would be mekadesh, the oil that was put in the lamps of the menorah. On my law, and Rebbe says to his son, Ner Yisrael, kachoya, the candle of Israel, the light of Israel, taka, you are correct. Now the Gemara discusses what happens if one of the lamps, one of the flames of the menorah extinguishes overnight. The menorah was lit every afternoon and it burnt until the morning. What happens if one of the flames extinguishes overnight? What do you do? Now this Gemara, it's a little bit, the words are, I think, a little bit hard to translate exactly, but we'll explain what's going on. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rebbe, says Rabbi Yochanan, Rebbe, Ner shekovsa, a flame that extinguished overnight, Nidashin Hashem Nidashna Psila. I think the point is that we basically, what do? We treat it as if everything's all ashy. That the wick needs to be replaced because it become ash. It needs to be replaced. The oil is full of ash. It needs to be replaced. The point is he's got to replace. If the flame extinguishes in the middle of the night, he replaces. He cleans out the lamp. And he replaces the oil and he replaces the wick. Ketzad Osa, how does he do it? Mativa, he prepares it. V'nosim b'shemen, and he puts in new oil, a new wick, umadlika, and he relights it. Yosef Reb Zrika, Yosef Kamibayle asks, Kishu nosim b'shemen kamida rishona or kamida shechasera? Reb Zrika wants to know that when the flame extinguishes and is being replaced, how much oil is put into the lamp? A full chatzi log? Like we started all over again, a full chatzi log? Or do we say it extinguished, 3/4 of the way through the night, and it had burnt through 3/4 of its oil. There was a quarter of a lamp of oil left. So let's just replace a quarter of a log, a quarter of what was there originally. Just put in whatever was remaining. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Pshita de Kimida Rishona. It's got to be that he puts in the full half a log. The Kimashe Chasera, because if he was only putting in our example, a quarter of that amount, Menor Adinon my Chiser. How are we going to know how much exactly needs to be put into the lamp. And if you're going to say, well, what do you mean? You'll just measure how much oil is left as you are replacing the lamp, the contents of the lamp. If that's the case, Sheva Midos Nofishlu Midos Tuva. Okay, if that's the case, then you're gonna have to have a lot more measures then to be able to measure also how much oil is left in the menorah if it extinguishes. Right? If we're saying that, you're gonna have to, how are you gonna know how much oil is there? You're gonna measure it out. So you're gonna have all these extra measures to be able to measure out in this situation. But we said there's only 7. Okay. Kari Ole ve'adar is a difficult pasuk. Ve'adarcho tzlach richav al dvar emes ve'anvo tzedek. So he's saying, so Reb Zrika says to Reb Yirmiyah that you are very sharp and you are finding the truth. Itmanayim was also stated, Amr Babble, Amr B'yechin, V'amrila, Amr Reb Abba, Amr Reb Chanina, Amr Rebbe. Ner shekovsa, that if the flame extinguishes, Nidoshin Hashem and Nidoshin Apsila, essentially you have to replace the oil and the wick. Kate Saros, how does he do it? Mativa, he replaces the oil in the wick, Venosim Bashemin, Kimida Rishona, and he puts in the full amount of oil, the full half log, Umadlika, and lights and rekindles the menorah, the lamp, the light. And now the Gemara discusses the construction of the menorah lamps. Specifically, when we learned about, was that on Daf Chavtes or earlier in the Masechta, that the menorah was chiseled from a solid piece of gold. Does that requirement include the lamps themselves? Or were the lamps able to be removed so that they can be cleaned properly and put back on? / if you say that the lamps are also chiseled out of the gold, well then how exactly do you clean them? Amar Vuna Brei Rav Yehuda Amar Sheshes Ner Sheba Mikdash Shel Prokim Ava. Says Rav Huna Brei Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav Sheshes that the lamps in the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash Shel Prokim Hava, they were of, what are prokim, like sections or something? Essentially, they were connected to the menorah, but they were able to be like bent over, so you could bend them towards the ground and empty them out. Kasover, the Rav Sheshes holds kiksiv when the pasuk says kikar umiksha a menorah v'neruseh ksiv, that when the pasuk talks about being solid gold and being chiseled out of solid gold, it includes the lamps. Kevin demibaya atova, and since you are going to have to be able to clean out the lamps and clean out the oil and put in new wicks, ilav de prokim ave lo ave metayva lay. If not for the fact that it was these prokim, I don't remember how exactly to translate it, but essentially these sections that you could move around and bend. So they're still coming from the same, chiseled out of the same piece of gold, but it was somehow maneuverable. You can kind of move it, not separate it, but bend it and empty out the oil that way. However, we have a question from a Braise. Ketzad Ose, how do you clean out the lamps? Misalkon, you remove them entirely from the menorah, i.e. they are separate from the menorah. Umanicham ba'ol, you put them down in the Beis Hamikdash, the Ol Moed, umekanchon besvog, and you clean it with a sponge. Vinosin boed shemen, and then you put in new oil, umadlikan, and then the menorah is lit. So we see in this brisa that the lamps were separate from the menorah, were detached from the menorah. Who the Amr Ki'atana of Sheshes holds like the following Tana, the Sana that we learn in the brisa. The Chacham say lo oyu mazizin osa mimekoma, that they wouldn't move the lamps from their place. 1 second. Mechlal the ibai le ozuza matzi mazizla. Wait 1 second. Does that, from the fact that we're saying that they wouldn't move the lamps from their place, does that imply that they could move the lamps from their place? And if they could move their lamps from their place, then why didn't they, in order to clean it out better? No, say rather that it was unable to be moved from its place. It was connected. It was part of the body of the menorah. Uman chachamim. Who are the chachamim? Right, we said the chachamim say essentially that it's connected to the menorah. It's all part of the same chunk of gold. Rab Elazar, Rab Tzadok, who Desani Rab Elazar, Rab Tzadok Ometz, Rab Elazar, Rab Tzadok, who says, Kimin Tas Shilzav Hoyala Al Gaba. Let's look at this slide for a second. I have a slide here. So this slide is be'etzem a lamp. This slide is be'etzem, it's a lamp. I don't know if this is exactly accurate. I think it's probably mostly accurate. So imagine that each of the 7 lamps on the menorah looked kind of like this, that it had on one side kind of a place for a wick that would go on right on that one side. So on one side there was a wick, and then there's the rest of the lamp, and it was covered. So imagine there was some kind of a lid on top of it that could slide back and forth. And in the lid, there was also a hole in the middle that the oil could be poured into. So we're saying what he would do first is he would move the lid, he would slide the lid to where the flame is currently, meaning when he was cleaning it out, he would slide the lid towards the direction of the lamp where the wick goes, and then he would empty out whatever was in the lamp, and then he would slide the cover back to its regular closed position, and there was a hole in the top of the lid, and he would pour the oil through that hole. There was a golden cover on the lamp. And when he would clean out the lamp, he would slide it towards where the wick rests and empty out whatever was in the lamp where the oil goes. And then he would, right? So, and then when he wants to put in more oil, he would basically slide back the cover, and there was a hole in the cover where he would pour the oil through there. So we see that there's a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok. In terms of the Tanakama says that the lamps were separate from the menorah, whereas Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok says that the lamps are part of the menorah. And what he would do is when he was cleaning out the lamps, he would slide that cover towards where the wick goes, and then he would basically you would be able to bend the lamp towards the ground so that whatever oil is could pour out, and then you would add more oil, but it was all connected to the menorah. We've looked at the Ani Tanoim, it's like the following Machlokes Tanoim, this Ani we learn in the Brayso menorah, that the menorah Vinei Roseh and its lamps, Bos Min HaKikar, all came from that same hunk of gold. Ve'ein Malkocheh Machtoseh Min HaKikar, however, the tongs and the shovels were not from that same chunk of gold. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, menorah Aisaba Min HaKikar, whereas Rabbi Nechemia disagrees, he says just the menorah was etched out of the hunk of gold, but not its lamps, nor its tongs, nor its shovels. So Bos Min HaKikar came from that chunk. So we see that the Tanakama says that the lamps were part of the same, were also chiseled from that chunk, and Rabbi Nechemia says no, it was not chiseled, it was separate. But Ma'ikam, you forget, what are they arguing about? Ba'ikra, they're arguing about the following pasuk, the sana that we learn in the Brayso, another Brayso. Kikazov tor, a pure hunk of gold. Yaisa osa, you should make the menorah from it. Lamanu la menorah shaba min hakikar, so we learn that the menorah comes from a hunk of gold. Minayin lerabos neruseh, how do we know that the candles, that the lamp also comes from that hunk of gold? Talmud Omer, es kol hakelim ha'ele. Right, the pasuk says, I'm reading the pasuk, kikar zav tar yaisa osa es kol hakelim ha'ele, all of these vessels, including the lamps. Is it possible that also the tongs and the shovels would come also from the hunk of gold? Talmud Lomer osa, it, which is limiting to exclude the tongs and the shovels. That's Reb Nechemiah's opinion. Now, the Gemara says, whoa, 1 second, one second. Interrupts the Brisa. Kasha Reb Nechemiah, 1 second. We had just said before that Reb Nechemiah's opinion was that the candles, that the lamps were not part of the hunk of gold. Now we're saying that the lamps are part of the hunk of gold. There was a machlokas tanoim about what Reb Nechemiah's opinion actually was. There are two different Tanas had differing opinions about what Reb Nechemiah's opinion actually was. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omes is Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha menorah ba min hakikar, that just the menorah came from the hunk of gold. Ve'ein malkochel umachlosel v'neirosel ba min hakikar, but the tongs, shovels, and the lamps as well did not come from that hunk of gold. Ve'elamani mekayim es kol hakein la'elis. So what do you do with all of these vessels came from that gold? Shayukulim shel zahav. Well, all of them were made of gold, but not necessarily from that same hunk of gold. Zahav be'edrik seba. But 1 second, we already know that. Vasisa nerosel shiva. Ve'heles nerosel ve'herer al eva panel umalkochel umachtosel zahav tahor. That its tongs and its shovels were pure gold. Lo nitzruch el lefi neris. What was needed for the, and I guess even the I think maybe you can even say the lamps themselves we see were gold, but it's needed for the openings of the lamps, because the opening of the lamp is where the wick was, and where the wick was, it becomes black. Sagdatik amino, I may have thought hoil ufineris ashchure mashchar, that since the opening of the lamp becomes black, maybe the Torah had wanted to be sensitive to the expenses of the Yidden. Maybe it didn't have to be zahav tahor, highest level gold. Maybe just any kind of gold would suffice. That would say no, even that also needs to be zahav tahor. That's what it means by, what was it? Eis kol hakelim ha'ele. All of these vessels need to be pure gold. Gewaldig. That was Daf Peches of Masechta Menachos. And Daf Peches of Masechta Menachos, we learned about the liquid measures. Yesterday we learned about the dry measures. Today we learned about the 7 liquid measures. Rabbi Yehuda listed them from smallest to largest. It was Machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Abaye outcome. Either it's because he says that each larger measure would include the lower measure before it, the smaller measure before it, but also either its over brim or its foam, it would be able to hold that as well. Rabbi Meir goes from the largest to the smallest to say no, each measure was exact, no more, no less. Reb Shimon swapped out the hin for 1.5 logs. He said, because he argues, look, there's no need. We don't have any need presently for the hin. So he says a log and a half is more useful because that could be used for the minchas chavitin every day. Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok says that the hin had etches on it. So according to Rashi, there was literally just one measure of a hin, and there were lines on the hin for this much for half a, and this much for a quarter of a, and this much for half of a log, etc. This much for a log. Tosfos says that there were 4 measures: a quarter of a log, a half a log, and then a hin that had etches on it, according to Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok. Now, if a candle of the menorah extinguishes before morning, so you clean it out and relight it with the same amount of oil as it had initially. And finally, the construction of the menorah lamps, one opinion was that the lamps were chiseled out of the same gold as the rest of the menorah. The other opinion was that the lamps were separate from the rest of the menorah. Friends, that was the Peches of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.